things I wanted to start by talking about was really thinking about the particular selection of works that you've chosen to exhibit in the gallery. You have sort of many different video works, but sort of why you actually chose to bring these three together. And I think not just talking about these works individually as individual entities, but also thinking about how they interact within the gallery and the kind of common threads that you can find throughout them. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking the thing that seems to be sort of the present or the continuous thing throughout them is the presence of bodies, specifically performing bodies. For example, in this video here, Choke, which is it's from 2017, the most recent one, we see these kind of two performing bodies in this kind of interaction, but in quite an ambiguous interaction. In the back gallery, we see sort of a lone male figure, again trying to enact some kind of performance or perform something, but perhaps failing in it to a certain extent. And then there's also a photograph which is connected to a film work, which is not displayed, but we just have the photograph, which is also kind of embedded with all of the kind of gesture, the staging, the costume, that could be associated with the kind of performance as well. So I guess maybe this is a place to start, is with this question of performance and your interest in it and how it relates to the body and your use of the body in the work.
Yes, I think that's, as you said, it's kind of common thread throughout almost all my work, and that I'm interested how somehow my deep belief that body is I used to believe that body is a kind of like very clean and very natural way of expression, and it's somehow without any influences from outside, but it's obviously not true. And since I realized that I was somehow focusing on how the body is like the first mediation of what we express and how we express our identity, and how the body is the place of interaction between like internal and some external forces, and the role we play in the situation we are in. So somehow in those three particular works, I focus on how male body is playing those role of being in a position of, I think, of power maybe, or trying to be in a position of power. So that's why we after discussion with John and with Kola, we chose those three particular works that they somehow fit together in this subject.
Yeah.
So I think that's this. I would say that one of my basic interest is how body interact with and external forces somehow.
But I guess it's also related to, the external force as well in a lot of your works is the relationship between sort of the subject and then you as a filmmaker, or the person who's framing these subjects, who's capturing them. And I think that that's also related to this kind of ambiguous boundary that there's always in your work between what's fact and what's fiction, what's a document and what's something that's being manipulated and constructed. And I guess it'd be interesting to hear about how you see yourself as kind of the author or the person behind the camera lens a lot of the time, and how you see your presence as sort of influencing these subjects in terms of what we're seeing.
And that's a good question. I don't have a prepared answer. I'm still asking this question myself, as I started with working with photography and now with video, so somehow I was usually in the position of directing, I would say, and constructing the situation, so that also I have this like quite maybe childish thinking that I can record situation as they are and like have people being as they are be in front of the camera, which is obviously not true. And when I realized that, I also try to play with that and see how I usually try to distance myself from the situation and somehow just give some basic instructions to the people I work with, to the participants, or I don't know how we call them, performers. I prefer the word participants. And that's a big question. And I'm somehow at the stage that I might try to use this my position as an artist more and maybe direct situations more. Before I used to just, even at some project, one of them, you've seen this Go See project, I filmed some models in the darkened room. I just left the camera recording the situation like automatically without any suggestions. So I tried to distance myself as much as I could. But it made me think that it's you know, you can distance yourself. It's somehow I use this. I always remember this protagonist from Wim Wenders' Lisbon Story film, that he wanted to distance. As he was a filmmaker, he wanted to distance himself from the image he took. So he was bearing this camera on his back, recording the city, and even didn't watch the tapes because he didn't want to somehow spoil the image with his gaze.
Yeah.
But then he realized that it's not possible, that this very strong conceptual thought is somehow, it doesn't reflect reality. So you really have to be responsible at least at minimum stage, at minimum point as a creator. So that's another big question for me as someone who I don't know, directs maybe.
Yeah. But I guess thinking specifically, like for example, the work in the back gallery, Do Over, perhaps you could speak about kind of your own role in that as a director, and also, because the person in the film is a musical conductor, you know, another kind of director. So just kind of maybe if you give a bit of background context to that work and how you sort of saw that interaction as happening for that work.
Well, with Daniel, the protagonist of this Do Over work, we worked together throughout the whole process of making the work, and we were choosing those particular gestures from the musical scores that he used to play, from the concert he used to play in his past, and so that was more like a cooperation. Then only at the very last stage of production of this work, we split, and I went behind the camera as a director, and he just took this role of a performer. But and it was all about his memory, his archive. So he was I would say the protagonist. I was somehow just the trigger to help him find the right. I suggested that we should look for gestures that are somehow ambiguous and at the age of being aggressive gestures, they're very powerful. So that was my suggestions as a director, I would say, but that was his choice of these particular gestures, and the way he performed them. So that in that way there was kind of clear division. But at the beginning, of course, we held a few meetings and we were talking about that, and we were researching for the right scores, and the idea of that kind of gesture wasn't from the beginning. It just came up when we were researching the subject together, of how conductor is in this position of conducting and directing the other musicians. So how him as a especially young director holds this position of power, how he uses that, and what role does he play in it.
Georgie?
Was it a similar type of process with Choke? Did you have a conversation beforehand where you sort of decided on what types of movements you'd like them to perform, or was it more like you let them kind of... Yeah.
But with Choke it was more, I started with visual references, so I just went through, because they are Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighters, so I went through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu manuals, and I picked up few photographs that I want to start with. And I simply showed them photographs to performers, and I asked them, would you please find some movements that lead to this moment? So that was their role, to come up with the idea what movements are leading to these particular pictures. So it was a bit similar with Do Over, but I think with Do Over it was much more open for Daniel to look for those gestures, because he went through all his archive, his memory, and it was I just want those few images, and could you please turn it into movements? So that's a bit similar, but maybe not it was more narrowed here, I guess.
I think what struck me the most about Do Over was just how the kind of decontextualization of that scenario. So what happens when you take, say, a musical conductor, but then if he doesn't have his orchestra, what happens to those gestures? And actually what happens is it becomes much more of an internal process. Because I think a lot of the way that we think about gesture is it's kind of about things going on inside our head as an internal thought, and then it having some kind of exterior representation to the gesture or something like that. And it needs almost that kind of cause and effect scenario which you have between a conductor and musicians.
Exactly.
So like what you see when you look at the at him, he has this kind of frustration, at times sadness, and it's this kind of almost trying to perform something but actually not getting anywhere with it. It kind of gets stuck almost in a feedback loop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what happens when you somehow, every one of us has audience in a way that we perform our actions, our gestures, our speeches to someone, and we get feedback more or less. And when you remove this feedback, you are stuck somehow. Like as you said, in a loop of repeating gestures that somehow are meaningless, more or less.
Yeah.
So that's what gives meaning to the gestures is a dialogue, is a conversation. So, but when you look at the gestures in a separate context, it really become awkward sometimes.
They become kind of abstracted or just completely,
And they are abstracted, but you probably look for some audience inside. So it's like I don't know, like inside monologue, and you somehow try to, without these external references, you I don't know. It's interesting because it becomes quite weird when you don't get feedback. It's like you are having a monologue with yourself, and that's something strange appears there, I guess. So that's.
I mean, when I was sort of researching and writing the text to accompany the show, I was looking at the writing of Trisha Brown, and you have a connection to sort of Trisha Brown in particular, but also that sort of relationship to dance and choreography, and kind of how that's very much embedded within the figure's movements. And maybe I'll read this quote because I brought it. I think it's quite a good. I saw a lot of parallels between what she's talking about when she's doing a performance, or the way that she sees movement in the relationship to what you see in that figure. And what she says is that pure movement, and this is her term, pure movement, is movement that has no other connotations. It's not functional or pantomimic. Mechanical body actions like bending, straightening, or rotating would qualify as pure movement, providing the context was neutral. I use pure movements as a kind of breakdown of body's capabilities. I do not promote the next movement with a preceding transition, and therefore I do not build up to something. I often return to a neutral standing position between moves. And that last line actually of kind of this idea of constantly trying to get somewhere, but also not wanting to create a kind of crescendo or build any kind of narrative through your movement. It seems to be what that figure is doing. The way that he does also return to a neutral standing position every time he then tries again to perform something.
Yes, I think that's quite good reference. This like neutral position that we. I know, but I'm not sure where this natural position is. I think what I'm trying to look through my works is maybe that neutral position somewhere. Like
you're trying to find that.
Probably, I think that yes. Like when does it happen? If it happens when you don't do anything, when it happens if you have a dialogue, I don't think that there is a neutral position at all. You never are neutral, are you? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So you always are in the context, and I'm not so much in choreography of Trisha Brown, of course. So maybe if I work, that's somehow my plans for the future, to work more with the body and somehow search this very physical area, and to maybe look for this somehow neutral state. But my deep belief is that you can't find it.
Yeah.
You are always in the context. You are always talking something to someone, even if you have no response. So you're always involved, I would say. And
I'm wondering whether with Choke, because obviously this video piece doesn't have any sound, and it's in slow motion, which is quite different from Do Over. I wonder whether this is an attempt to decontextualize it even more, to try and find something that is not necessarily neutral, but like not defined so much by the time or the sound or the situation, because you've got this like zoomed in, this zoomed in kind of silenced and very, very concentrated.
Yes, that was an attempt to abstract the movements and recontextualize them. It was maybe a bit different than in Do Over. Do Over was more like again removing like all the context, but leaving the gestures itself and its movement and pace and the sound. Here it's a bit different. It's a bit similar. It's just different mediation, different sources to do that. I guess.
For me as well, like, I think that it's about the facial expression. So for in Do-Over, you do actually see the figure's facial expression. You see there's a kind of narrative that you build through what he's showing on his face, whereas here you completely remove that. So it's actually just completely, almost in a much more kind of concise way, just to the body. And so you see that ambiguity between the interplay of these two bodies. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about like the kind of the context of this work in terms of how you started working with these people, or kind of the process of how you actually staged this particular work.
Yes, it's maybe let's get back to this facial expression. That's I somehow removed that to focus more on relational context, because with Do-Over it's like as you mentioned, this Daniel is somehow contained within himself, and here I wanted to accent the relation between those two males. And I about the context of the work, I was not participating, but watching the jiu-jitsu fighters while they're training, and I simply somehow recorded that, and I was looking for those kind of movements that might reflect, again, when slowed down, ambiguity of where is the fight and where is the intimate contact between them. So the fight is at intimate contact, and of course probably everyone understand that and realize that, but for them who just like train that, I don't think they focus on that aspect of the fight. They somehow want to express that's the question, what they think they probably want to express, I don't know, their masculinity and power and force, and for me that was expression of like need for close relationship that you can't freely express outside the training area.
Yeah.
That's why I somehow focused on the fight and slowed them down in a way that it looks like a very intimate contact. It is an intimate contact. You can clearly see it here when you somehow shift the gaze from normal pace, the sound, and the normal, usual context of the fight.
Because I think if you look at the bodies, I mean, that effect of slowing it down, you still see kind of, the muscles and the tensions and the sinews like underneath their skin, and that's completely related to both either a kind of fight or a kind of intimate, eroticized kind of scenario. And I think that what you're saying about kind of, we think about these scenarios of kind of two men fighting in that kind of context as being a very masculine thing, but it's also that kind of the way in which kind of that performance of masculinity often relies a lot on incredible sort of like close contact, but it's also like a fine line in terms of what you do with that contact. And actually by slowing it down in this way, you show that actually kind of embedded in all of these movements is the potential for like an erotic reading, or a certain sense of touch within their movements.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's what I wanted to show. Like it was that was the idea to show. That's why I focused on fight, because it's so at the surface, it's so distant. It's so different than intimacy. But while I was working on this piece, I just watched some trailer of some thriller movie or something, and there was it was quite funny, but the film itself. But there was a phrase that a murder is like the most intimate of crimes, and I just realized that it's, of course, it's banal and it's obvious, but I realized that yes, it is. And if you want to like murder someone, you have to be very close, and this ambiguity of intimate and violence, it's something interesting for me.
I guess that very much relates to the photograph as well in the back gallery, because that kind of presence of violence, of close contact, is completely related to that. And actually it'd be maybe helpful if we talk about the film that comes from, and kind of this, because there's a whole there's a source image that work came from, there's a whole sort of study. Maybe if you could speak about that, because I think that's quite an interesting context.
Yes, you're right.
This work.
Yeah, restraints. The idea for restraint came when I came across a photograph. It was a documentary photograph from, I think, the 60s that Larry Sultan and Mike Mandela used in their project from 70s. So it was one first of the major projects about the archive of photography, and they simply decontextualized the documentary photographs and put them to the gallery. So they somehow shifted it to the art context. And I was thinking about how the way of visualizing and the difference between documentary and fiction, and how the language of documentary changes, how we can manipulate it. And then I somehow came across with come up with the idea to reenact this photograph, but changing the context. And I changed the context from American situation that there was a cop restraining some young men. And I changed it to the situation of Second World War and Warsaw Uprising in Poland. So I somehow played with this documentary, reenacted it, but also changed the context of it. And I made this photograph that you can see here, and a video that was a 3-channel installation. And yeah, that was quite interesting because the reenacting was I was working with those historical reconstruction groups, and that was for them reenactments were of course like daily routine, but it was also kind of cathartic way of dealing with history.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting for me to talk to them about how they work and how they get into those roles. They were no actors, no amateurs, they were like passionate about that. So it's another category between like being completely natural and being like completely fake. So that was also interesting, that how they get involved with those roles and how they distance from it at the same time. And I think reenactment has this ambiguity of being very close to some event and at the same time being distanced from it, and that's why I think that's interesting.
And I guess also the thing about reenactment is that it relies on this kind of repetitive act of doing something again and again. Yeah. And the video for restraint has a similar sort of structure to the way that do-over is working, where you again return to this kind of neutral standing position. They sort of manhandle this person and then they stop again, then they manhandle again and they stop again. And that kind of repetition, but in order to access some kind of difference or some kind of cathartic kind of potential or something almost like an anomaly. And a lot of the time when we repeat things, they become kind of absurd. They become kind of surrealized through that sort of repeated. It's like when you say a word multiple times, it becomes slightly odd. So I guess, is that something that you were thinking about in terms of how these performances just kind of can become, made absurd essentially?
Yes, exactly. And at the same time I was thinking about how reenacting some situation creates kind of narration that we somehow get familiarized with, and we repeat those narrations, especially in context of history. When you see some repetition of histories in books, and you see those narration become a history. So repetition also has this function of making something familiar and making something undisputable, I guess. And also when there's a thin boundary between making something quite serious, like a narration, and making something absurd. That's why I left when I was filming, and I was of course wondering if I should leave those neutral positions in that piece or not, and I decided to do it because it showed how these repetitive actions are absurd, as you said, how they're like fake, and it's but at the same time it shows how this power of reenactment, how this power of repeating and creating a narration is created. Like it's somehow, I would say it's like behind the stage piece of making a historical narration.
It's not, I mean, I guess it's reenactment, but then it's also role-playing and assuming different roles. And I remember when we first had a discussion, I mentioned it reminded me a lot of kind of the Zimbardo prison experiment, which is this, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of this quite famous psychological experiment that was conducted in Stanford University, where a group of students were kind of asked to participate in an experiment to sort of question how different people can assume roles. So the thing that they put together was the relationship between a prison guard and a prisoner. And they laid out in the basement of Stanford University this scenario whereby people were sort of randomly selected to be one of these two different roles. and the whole experiment had to be shut down within 6 days because of the brutality and the way that people so quickly, assumed these positions in terms of the prison guards who are actually kind of abusing the inmates, and just very kind of readily occupied this role. And I think that that's quite an interesting question of just seeing. Okay, it's kind of about conformity or obedience, but it's also about just kind of what is within people in terms of if they're given a certain uniform or they're given a certain frame for performance and behaviour, different behavioural tropes, what that does to people. And I think that work, the way that you sort of put it in this very particular context of Nazism, is related to that in terms of like SS guards and things like that, and like what it says about like human behaviour on a like a wider sense.
Exactly, yes, or maybe about human nature. I don't know. That this experiment was really interesting, and I wasn't influenced like consciously about this experiment by doing this work. But when I was talking to those people from construction, what struck me that somehow, I'm not sure now if that's because they made some choices that there was a group that reconstruct those German people, and there was a group reconstruct those civilian people, and sometimes they swap, but it's very rare. They told me after one of those civilian people told me the story that their friend was role playing the civilians, but at some point he changed the group and he started to play the German, and they somehow treated it as he was a traitor, like he came to like this dark side of history or something, and that was like they were really serious about that. They were not friends anymore. So it's not just, it reflects this role playing. It reflects, because if you're an actor, you have to somehow probably play many different roles. You can be a bad guy, you can be a good guy, you can be like whatever. But if in that situation of being passionate about something, I think it's more visible what path do you choose, and what struck me that all those German reenactments were like a quite big men that were like really, well, they were nice, but at the age of being I wouldn't like them to be my friends for like a long time. And those civilians were really like young people from high schools, and they really they didn't want me to pay them for taking part in this piece. They were really like idealistic, and they thought that reflects probably what is their mindset.
Yeah.
So that was also like kind of like what makes you make those choices, which role you're playing. That's in this experiment. You said it's from what I know, they were assigned to play those roles, right? They didn't decide themselves.
No, they were randomly selected.
So it's I think that's the difference between the experiment and the reenactment. People from reenactment group, they just consciously choose their roles.
Yeah.
So that's if we treat reenactments as a kind of experiment, it says something different than Zimbardo's one, I guess, because it's more free. Somehow.
Well, there's also quite a freeing, or like you said about catharsis, there's something that's kind of about the adrenaline or the actual excitement of being able to inhabit something that's not your sort of daily persona. I mean, it reminds me a lot of, I don't know if you know about like riot tourism, which is this phenomenon where people go to kind of dislocated from a socio-political context, but they'll travel to different kind of places where there's an uprising or there's a riot, and they will join that particular thing and sort of join a riot just for the sheer kind of decontextualized thrill or adrenaline of being.
But is the riot
in that
reenacted, or
context.
the riot is like?
No, it's a real one. So they'll trace them via the internet, and they'll go there and sort of kind of do it as in an almost like touristic way. But it's like that just relates to that idea of what that does to you when you kind of have that adrenaline, when you are able to assume a role, even if it's not actually personally connected to your own context or history, and just how those things play out, and what it's so much more about kind of the self-gratification or the sort of your own persona.
Yes, that brings us to the question of like how you construct your identity, I guess. If you usually it's somehow unconscious. Well, you make choices like you want to read this book and go to this party and meet those people and like dress in that way or the other. But in terms of like those group cathartic experiences, it's that's I think that's strong. If you just you want to play that part in kind of like history and be and embody it.
Yeah.
That's that's interesting. I didn't know that it's going on.
Yeah,
That's
nice.
quite crazy.
I mean, I guess also thinking we haven't really spoken about kind of your background, I guess, in terms of like where you studied. I mean, you studied philosophy to begin with, and then you also studied photography, and then you also I know worked with Miroslav Bałka at the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw. So I guess my question is kind of thinking about how all of those different threads have kind of fed into the kind of work that you make, and then also in terms of your reference points and the different. I mean, I know you spoke about the Mandel and that evidence project in specific relation to restraint, but also how you think about how you sort of research and come up with different sort of draw upon different historical sources to feed into your works.
Yeah, I think I try to read a lot. That's my historical, my philosophical background, I guess, and I'm trying to fight it because that was really hard when you study philosophy. I somehow at some point I stopped doing that, and I decided that art is more like close to like making, doing, and not just thinking. But it's still like I'm researching a lot. That's the way I work, and I think philosophy had a quite big impact on what subjects I choose, I guess. Like it's usually in all those, I think in most of my projects is somehow this reflection on how mediation works and how it's also probably because of I studied photography. So when that was my first attempt to make art, and I didn't draw, I didn't paint. So I had this my first medium was a medium that is like almost completely transparent and almost like really engaging with reality, but still it's mediated. So I think all this thread that somehow is common to those old works is what happens when you have this transparent medium between you and reality, and how you deal with that. That's why I somehow have this urge of like removing this medium and seeing what will happen. That's probably what I'm gonna do in the future, to like engage more with life situations and more with performance and like this word with like situation and performative situation, I would say. So I think like photography and philosophy had a really big impact on what subject I do and how I realize them. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, maybe that's a nice thing to sort of think about, as well as also, I mean, we spoke the other day, you were saying about how, you actually wanted to go beyond the camera, or kind of, and is that because of kind of a sort of just awareness of the fact of how much it constructs something? Like how much, is it about your presence in terms of the work? Like wanting to more initiate more of a live situation whereby things can happen in more of a free way? Or is it, because then it's also about how much would you then conduct a certain live performance? Because you still have a director if it's going to sort of construct something. So it's what's sort of the reason for wanting to go beyond this medium?
Well, I think I know what's the reason. I know that maybe the art is a bit similar to what you're making this reference points to McCarthy novel of of Reminder, and this like art of being somehow this like impossible art to be really like synchronized with reality without mediation. That's why he made those repetitions and reenactments. And I think that I have a bit the same. I know it's impossible, but that's why I have this like temptation of removing the camera and mediation. And I did it once in Dublin when me and two of my friends, we created a kind of like film without the camera, and when we staged few small, almost undistinguishable from reality performances, and we invited the audience that was strolling through the riverside, and we staged those performances. It was funny because the audience mistaken real situation for performances and didn't notice some performances and took it as a reality. So this this difference between film or cinematic, something fictional, and reality was somehow removed, and that was I would say like kind of small personal success to remove the camera and seeing what's happened. And that was amazing because what happened was, because probably that all art is about like empowering the fragility of how you see the reality. So to see it in a bit different way, And then we succeeded to do it without the camera, without the medium. But of course, people were the medium. So that somehow, that was I would say, first attempt to use people as a medium. Of course, here also people are kind of medium, but it's mainly the camera, I would say, especially in this piece, because it's slowed down, it's like lit, it's staged. This piece is really staged. So, maybe that would be the starting point.
The novel that you're referring to is one that I was drawing upon in the text, which is Tom McCarthy's novel Remainder, which is, for those of you who haven't read it, it's about this character who suffers this kind of ambiguous accident, and then ever since when he's moving past this accident, trying to sort of recuperate, he has this desire to kind of create or reconstruct certain scenarios in order to access a moment that is real or is kind of fluent with reality, is kind of authentic. And he sort of he gets this large sum of money as an insurance claim because of the accident, and uses it to create this. He sort of inhabits a house, creates these kind of scenarios where he just repeats it, reenacts it again and again, in order to, get to what we're talking about in terms of like a real moment catharsis. And this just becomes this kind of endless, impossible task throughout the novel. And what it actually ends in is this incredibly violent scenario where he stages a bank heist. But doesn't tell any of the participants that he's actually equipping them with real weapons. So it becomes this kind of, I've just spoiled the end of the story, but it's you end up with this very violent, bloody kind of conclusion to something where, in terms of what it actually means to be kind of authentic or real, which I guess is something that, as you said, you're constantly kind of trying to navigate or find out if that's actually possible through documentation, through that.
I hope my art won't lead me to like this scenario one day. But it's I know lately I was watching this series about serial killers, Manhunter, I guess, and there is something about there's a film called of Michael Mann, I can't recall the name of, but there is something that those killers has this urge of like. I don't know, like the act of killing would be maybe the I'm not sure if I should say that, but maybe the act of killing would be sometimes it appears in Tom McCarthy's novel as well, that he used those real weapons to somehow access the reality, because he somehow removed the mediation. Mediation was reenactment. When you put like real bullets in the gun, you somehow removed, using my vocabulary, removing the camera from the event. So. That's making something real was probably is like a temptation for most artists and many of us, I guess, like in many fields of like creation. But
maybe we should open it out. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
This is where we might refer to this. Like in psychoanalytical terms, the distinction between acting out and working through, because what you mentioned is the word that has been appearing is catharsis, which would be probably more towards working through, whereas it doesn't necessarily have to be the outcome of every act of whether conscious or unconscious repetition of a trauma. So I wonder, like, would you rather see these kind of repetitions and reenactments that you stage? More in terms of like in what direction would you see the outcome? Is it like more of an acting out, or something that might eventually lead to working through of some kind of trauma, either mediated or direct?
Good question. If I could choose,
like, would you see any kind of end to it? Or is it just a process?
I don't know. Well, it probably refers to what how I work and what subjects I undertake at some stage of my like practice, and I think that's working through, I would say. So I'm working with subjects I want to work through it then somehow, and then for this day I don't see any like result or ending of this. It's like it constantly changes. So like my subjects were 5 years ago were quite similar, but a bit different than they are now, and in a few years probably will be different as well. So it's like so maybe the art is like constant working through some subjects, probably. But if I could choose, it would be like acting out. That was the term, and like just act out and be finished with that. But I'm not so sure that's possible. I don't think so. But that's an interesting question.
I guess it's also a question of end point as well, because actually the whole point about that is that actually it's potentially an infinite thing, constant questioning, constant proposals. Like there's an infinite combination of times that you could do that. Like it's not.
It would be lovely. I would have to.
Obviously, it's frustrating, but it's actually like that is kind of the act of doing that, of repeating. Like it doesn't end, and that's almost like the frustration or the process that you're seeing in your work, or that you're trying to. It's almost like riding that wave. It's not. I wouldn't say that it doesn't seem to me like you're trying to go from A to B in a conclusive way, but actually it's a very open, durational kind of.
Yes, but at some point there's always this moment that I shot it and I just made post-production, I exhibit it. So I think that might be this like ending point. And what there's this film called about a guy who wins a big prize and makes a big reconstruction in some studio house, and they make it bigger, and he basically wants to make it's Synagogue, New York, I think, Synagogue, New York. And he wants to reconstruct some make a theater play, but somehow this theater play melts with his life, and this theater play becomes his life, and somehow those boundaries are, there is no boundary between art and life, and it ends when he dies simply. So I think also when you we had this conversation at Slate about this Pasolini text about long take. When you have long take, like he somehow refers to life as a long take. When you have a long take, and this long take cuts when you die, and this cut makes this long take be meaningful. So probably this cut is like when you produce a moving image or some other piece. Probably it's like when you cut it. And if I could choose, I would love to have one piece that I just takes as long as I live, and I don't know who would exhibit it after I die. That would be probably my best exhibition ever. But
does anyone else have any questions?
Well, maybe that's a good point to start with. And of course, if there are any more questions, you're invited to stay, watch the other movies, and engage more with both speakers. But I also would like to mention that Joseph wrote a text, and we just produced a brochure. So if you'd like to take it away with you, most welcome as well. So thank you, and
thanks. Thank you.